Laura's fingers tapped the steering wheel anxiously. Her pulse rose with a mixture of amusement and regret as she pulled into the parking lot of El Petit Bistro. She turned to check her reflection in the rear-view mirror, fixed a stray strand of hair, and reapplied her lipstick. Far enough from her suburban existence, she felt comfortable in the restaurant. No one she knew would cross her path here. She was having a private lunch with her colleague turned boyfriend Josh. She pushed thoughts of Mark and Jacob to the back of her mind as she got out of the car. Her time was here. Her escape. Josh had already reserved a corner table. When Laura entered, he spotted her immediately. His eyes sparkled, and he grinned widely. He rose to meet her and pulled out her chair. "You are so beautiful," he said, pointing his hand to her ass. Laura felt a flutter in her stomach as she sat down. "You are appreciated. You are not that terrible in person," Josh added. Both of them wanted to maximize their time together and placed their orders. Josh leaned across the table and took Laura's hand in his. "I've been thinking about you all morning." His thumb was tracing circles on her palm. Laura leaned forward and lowered her voice. "And what exactly were you thinking?" Josh started to smile mischievously before he could answer. Laura's eyes widened in fear as she recognized a familiar face in the coffee. Panic gripped her chest as Jacob, her teenage son, was hanging out with a group of friends, laughing and joking as if in slow motion. His eyes wandered across the room and landed right on his mother and the man holding her hand. She ripped her hand away from Josh and was almost a water glass in her way. "I have to go," she stammered, reaching for her paperback and quickly standing up. Josh stared confused. "Laura, what's going on?" She was already clicking quickly across the restaurant floor and moving in her shoes. She just arrived at Jacob's table when he started to stand. His expression was a mixture of confusion and dawning understanding. Laura hissed and clutched Jacob's arm. "We need to talk right now." She ignored the curious glances of his friends and pulled him towards the door outside to come the corner of the building where they were not visible from the restaurant windows. Jacob yanked his arm free and his face stiffened. "Mom, what the hell is going on? Who is this person guy?" Laura's mind was racing, looking for a reason, a justification, anything, but as she stared into her son's eyes she saw something that made her blood run cold. Disappointment and hate. "Please, Jacob," her voice trembled. "Your father can't know about this. It's different to what you think." Jacob laughed and crossed his arms. "Actually, it's not. It seems like you're betraying Dad." Tears welled up in the corners of Laura's eyes. She wanted to touch Jacob's arm, but he flinched. "Honey, please, you have to understand your father, and I haven't been good for some time. Josh, he's bringing me back to life." Jacob's expression unmoved. "Actually, it was getting colder. So you're going to throw our family away for what? A man who buys you fancy lunches?" Laura's throat tightened. She had to keep him quiet. She needed him to understand. Words flowed from her mouth, words she never thought she would say to her own child. Would say, "I swear I will leave your father for someone who will make us rich. If you keep this from him, you could have a very good father who offers everything." But Laura wanted to take the words back as soon as they left her mouth. Shock followed by pain flashed across Jacob's face, then an icy anger overcame him. He fixed her with a long, incomprehensible look, then turned and walked away without saying another word. Laura stood rooted to the spot and watched as her son's back turned away. The weight of what she had just done made her sick. How had it come to this? How had she become this person after what felt like a lifetime? She fought against herself to move. She had to go back to Josh and save everything that was left of this afternoon. As she walked back into the restaurant, she felt a pit develop in her stomach, a feeling of fear that warned her that nothing would ever be the same again. Josh looked up as she approached the table, visibly worried. "Laura, what happened? Are you okay?" She forced a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Everything is fine. I just ran into someone I knew. It's all done." Laura tried to focus on Josh, on dinner, on anything other than the look in Jacob's eyes as he walked away, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had just been set in motion, something she might never be able to erase. She sat down and picked up her fork with shaking hands. The rest of lunch passed in a haze. Laura nodded and smiled at the appropriate times, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the confrontation with Jacob and wondering if there was anything she could have said that would have made a difference. As they left the restaurant, Josh leaned close and whispered in her ear, "I have a surprise for you tonight." Laura's stomach churned at the thought of returning home to face Jacob and Mark. Perhaps another night of escaping wouldn't hurt. One more night before she had to deal with the consequences of her actions. "Fine," she replied and tried to smile. "I'll be there." As Laura drove to Josh's apartment that evening, her phone was buzzing with messages from Mark. "Where are you? Are you working late again?" She dismissed her. Guilt consumed her from the inside. One more night, she told herself. She would figure out how to fix this mess tomorrow, but as she rested in Josh's arms that night and sleep eluded her, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late, that the life she had known was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing to hold on to. Dawn came, gray and overcast, matching Laura's mood. She had left Josh's apartment early, had driven home, and was desperate to return. She had to try and work things out with Jacob before Mark went to work so Jacob could tell his father what he had seen. Laura took a deep breath as she pulled into the driveway, preparing herself for the impending confrontation, but when she tried to unlock the front door, her key wouldn't turn. She frowned and repeated the motion. Nothing. Terror rose at her throat. Laura knocked on the door. "Mark, Jacob, is someone home?" She heard footsteps approaching, then the sound of the lock turning. The door opened, revealing Jacob, his face completely calm, the stark contrast to Laura's explosive intensity. "Jacques, thank God," said Laura, and relief washed over her. "What is wrong with the lock?" But Jacob blocked her way with his palm as she tried to go in. He held a stack of papers in his hand and stepped in front of her. Laura's heart s. She knew what they were now. "I do ain't want a rich dad," said Jacob in a flat and cold voice. "I love my real father." Laura staggered back. The world spun around her. This couldn't happen. It was all too soon, too fast. Mark had found out so quickly. Jacob continued, "When I got home yesterday, I told Dad everything straight away. He Didn't scream, didn't cry, he just went to work. Laura stared at the divorce that Jacob was holding in his hand. Her own son served up her divorce papers. The betrayal cut deep and left her breathless. Jacob, please, she called out in a pleading voice. We need to talk, we can fix this. Jacob's expression remained blank. With his other hand, he pointed to a small, neatly wrapped gift. Dad has already agreed. He says this is just for your beloved. Laura took the box with shaking hands. Her weight was bigger than her expected. She ripped open the expensive velvet wrapping paper and her pulse pounded in her ears. Laura's eyes widened as the contents of the box were revealed. A scream tore from her throat as she fell to the floor and the box fell from her hands. Inside was a framed picture, Josh grinning and content surrounded by two small children and a stunning woman. Laura collapsed in the doorway, screaming and wailing as she realized the family she hadn't known existed. She could feel movement in the house, just barely. She watched Mark sitting coolly at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in his hand. No emotion was visible through her tears on his face as he watched her fall apart. Inside, Jacob came in. Mark said in a calm voice, "Keep the door closed." Jacob paused for a moment, staring down at his mother. Laura felt as though she felt pity in his gaze for a split second, then it was gone, replaced by the same icy determination Mark had seen. Laura was left on the porch as the door closed with a final audible click. She pulled herself away inside and sobbed against her body. How could things go so wrong so quickly? Inside, Mark grabbed a sip of his coffee. His eyes never left the closed door. "Son, come down," he said. "We need to discuss this." Jacob slid against his father and fell into the chair. "Mom will be fine," said Jacob, although his shoulders were tense. Mar's face relaxed a little as he stared at his son. "She chose while I stared at her," Mark said in a firm but heavy voice. "Now she has to live with the results." "But Dad, I never thought of that," Jacob stuttered, but Mark raised his hand to silence him. "I'm glad you told me you did the right thing." "Mark, what happens next? That's up to me, you understand?" Jacob nodded slowly, a mixture of relief and doubt on his face. Mark pushed forward, his voice low and strong. "Your mother has turned on us, Jacob. She was ready to throw everything we've built, everything we are, for a man she barely knows, a married man at that." He pointed to the door where Laura's *T could still be heard. "This box, Mark, just the beginning. She needs to know exactly what she missed. What is her course of action?" Jacob's voice started to tremble. "What do you mean by that?" Mark smiled coldly and calculatedly. "You shouldn't worry about that. When I'm done, I'll have everything prepared. She'll wish she never looked at another man." Jacob's spine shivered as he listened to his father plan his retribution. He had wanted his mother to be held accountable for her actions, but this felt different, like something much more sinister. Laura's screams had turned to soft whimpers. She sat up with the support of the porch railing and could see Mark and Jacob deep in conversation through the window. Seeing them together against her sent a new wave of agony across her chest. She staggered toward her car and fumbled with the keys. She needed to walk away and think. Laura knew she had nowhere to run, though. As she turned the engine on, she realized there was no family willing to take her in. There was only Josh, and even he, no one who would understand. Laura felt a lump rising in her throat as she pictured the image that flashed in her mind, the image of Josh's family. She had destroyed everything, her own family devastated for a man who had lied to her. From the start, she felt the finality descend upon her as she drove away from the house that had been her home for 10 years. This marked the end of her marriage and her relationship with Josh. Laura couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of her downfall as the house disappeared from her rear-view mirror, marking the end of the life she thought she knew. Inside the house, Mark saw Laura's car drive away. He walked over to Jacob. His face was grim but focused. "Keep this moment in mind, son. We start rebuilding, just you and me here," he added. Jacob nodded. A mix of emotions swirled in his chest, anger at his mother, fear of what was to come, and a fierce loyalty to his father that surprised even him. They began to discuss the pragmatic aspects of their new existence, changing locks, calling lawyers, canceling credit cards. Neither of them looked at the small wrapped box that was still on the porch. Stood a final gentle reminder of the secrets and lies that had torn their family apart. For Marcus and Jacob, it was the sunset over a house broken in two, but also the beginning of something new, a bond forged under the weight of shared suffering and strengthened by the shared pursuit of justice. Or was it payback? Time would tell. How it works. Josh's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at his phone. The caller ID showed his wife's name, and he knew he should answer, but fear paralyzed him. His thumb hovered over the screen. Finally, for what seemed like an eternity, he swiped to answer the phone. "Hello," he explained, his voice just above a whisper. The speaker's blood ran cold as the sobs began. Between sobs, his wife managed to choke. "How could you do this? How could you treat us like this?" Josh's mind raced, trying to make sense of her words. "Honey, what do you mean? What's wrong? Play stupid with me, not with others," she screamed in a rough, angry, painless voice. "Josh, I have the photos. I wrote everything down. You and that woman." How long ago? When Josh realized what had happened, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Someone had emailed his wife pictures of him and Laura. Their secret was out, and his carefully crafted life was falling apart around him. "Listen, I can explain," he began, but his wife interrupted him. "Save it. I'll take the kids with me. Don't come home. We won't be there." The connection went dead. Josh stood frozen in the middle of his workstation, the phone still pressed to his ear. He thought he might be sick. How had this all happened? When the truth dawned, panic set in. Who had sent the pictures? He had to talk to Laura. She had to know about this. He called her, but the call went straight to voicemail. Damn, he cursed and slammed his fist on his desk. He had to find out what was going on and find out who had done this. Josh ignored the curious looks of his colleagues, stormed out of his office, and went to Laura's desk. His eyes darted around the room. She looked pale and unfocused and sat at her desk. As soon as she sensed his presence, her eyes filled with panic. Josh grabbed her arm. and pulled her roughly to her feet. She watched his expression. Without speaking. "We need to talk," he yelled, and pulled her into an empty examination room. Once he was inside, he closed the door violently. He rounded Laura with angry eyes. "What the hell have you done?" he demanded. Laura staggered to her back, hitting the wall. "What are you talking about?" she asked, confused. "Don't play the fool," Josh yelled, repeating the words his wife had spoken earlier. "Someone sent me pictures of my wife. She leaves with the kids. I ruined my life." Laura's expression turned to one of understanding, which was quickly followed by fear. "Oh God," she said. "Josh, I swear I didn't do that. I would never do that." "Then who did it?" Josh's voice was quiet and dangerous. "Besides, who else knew about us?" Laura's mind was racing, trying to put it all together. She remembered the day in the restaurant. "My son saw us together," she whispered in a barely audible voice. "He couldn't do that." Josh laughed bitterly. "Well, someone did it, and right now we're both screwed." As if on cue, there was a loud noise at the door, and Josh froze, panic in her eyes. The door opened to reveal Dr. Simmons, the clinic manager. "Josh," Laura noticed. He was solemnly my office now. The walk to Dr. Simmons' office felt like a march to the gallows. They entered to see two more members of the clinic management already seated. The air was thick with tension. Dr. Simmons settled behind his desk and stared sternly at Josh and Laura. "You both know why you are here, of course," he began. "In regards to the nature of your relationship, we have some disturbing facts." Josh began to speak, but Dr. Simmons raised his hand to silence him. "I want you to understand the seriousness of the matter before you speak," Dr. Simmons continued. "Aside from violating company rules, your actions put the reputation of this clinic at risk." He looked at Josh. "Given the seriousness of this allegation and the supporting evidence, we are compelled to dismiss you with immediate effect." "You cannot do that," Josh protested, his face turning colorless. "I have been working here for years. I have rights." Dr. Simmons cut him off coldly. "Before you have an illicit affair with a colleague, you should have thought about it. Security will take you to your office to clear your things." Dr. Simmons turned his focus to Laura as Josh was led away. "As for you, Laura, you are on unpaid leave pending further investigation regarding the outcome." Laura nodded, numb, unable to form words. A thorough investigation would be reported. She could feel her colleagues staring at her as she left the office. The guilt and humiliation were too much. She could hear murmuring behind her. Josh left her waiting outside the clinic. His face was a mask covering anger and despair. He spat out, "This is all your fault." Laura shot back her own anger. "I'm not sure my fault was negligent. It was you who lied about your marital status. You turned my life upside down." There they stood looking at each other. Once the passion that had brought them together turned into something ugly and evil. Laura saw Josh in the same moment for what was real, not a dream of a better life or an escape, but a feeling that had haunted her the whole time. "Ben said get away from me," she remarked in an icy voice. "We are done." Laura felt a strange mixture of satisfaction that the lies were finally over, despair at the devastation to her life, and creeping fear as she turned away and left Josh alone in the parking lot. She understood that her problems were just beginning. She had no idea that on the other side of town Mark was just beginning his plan of retaliation. Mark listened to the details of the divorce proceedings while he sat grinning in his lawyer's office. Richard Hartley, the lawyer, a shark in an expensive suit, explained their course of action. "We have a big advantage if we move quickly," Hartley made clear, using the facts of her adultery and the impact on her son. "We plead for full custody of Jacob as well as a distribution of assets largely in her favor." Mark turned his steely eyes to the mansion and the bank account. Hartley wore a predatory smile. "Mrs. Beaufort's access to all joint accounts was blocked this morning, citing her adultery and her abandonment. We have applied for sole use of the marital home. She will be excluded from it both practically and literally." "Lovely," murmured Mark, leaning back in his chair. "Our next action is Hartley has taken out another file. Our first priority should be to develop a story for her community as well as the court," said Hartley. "Our position improves the more isolated Laura can be made." Mark raised an eyebrow, interested. "What was going through your mind?" "Small communities are based on rumors," continued Hartley. "Mrs. Beaufort, we just need to gently steer things in the right direction." Mark felt good leaving the law office. Laura had betrayed him and was ready to throw his family in for an affair. She would now learn the results of her actions. Mark put his strategy into action over the next 3 weeks. He began with little remarks to neighbors, expressing his concern about Laura's unpredictable behavior and neglect of her household duties. Always with an attitude of reluctance to disclose, he contacted mutual friends at the country club and revealed carefully selected details about their affair. He made sure he was seen as dedicated single father who brought Jacob along and had honest conversations about the difficulties of raising a teenager alone. The sympathetic looks and encouraging words from other members confirmed that his approach was working. Laura saw her world falling apart around her. Friends stopped answering her calls. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Even her own family, who were desperately wanted, were irritated and cold. "How could you treat Mark like that?" her sister had asked. Her voice was clearly heard. "He is a good man, a really nice man, and you have impoverished Jacob. You should be ashamed of yourself." On a warm Saturday night, Laura's reputation took a final hit. Mark had arranged a casual meal at Lupit Bistro, the same restaurant where Laura had been seen with Josh. Among the various powerful figures in town, he had invited the head of the PDA, the police chief, and in a particularly nasty twist, Josh's estranged wife held court. With elegance and a hint of vulnerability as they sat around the table enjoying their meal, he told Laura's tale of betrayal. "I just never saw it coming," he replied, shaking my head. "Unfortunately, on those late nights at the office, I assumed she worked for our family. She was actually working on something else entirely." The group murmured sympathetically and stared at Josh's wife, who sat stiffly in her chair, her face a mask of pain and anger. "The worst thing," Mark continued conspiratorially, "is what Laura did to Jacob. He is quite insulted and angry. Imagine his own mother carrying on with another man. Gasps and frightened looks passed around the table. Mark's words brought the intended result. He was about to launch into another well-prepared anecdote when Josh staggered into the restaurant, obviously drunk. As everyone turned to look at the disturbance at the door, they saw Josh's disheveled clothes and wild eyes. He lunged at their table when he found his wife. "Baby, please," he murmured, reaching for her. "You really have to look after me. It was a mistake." "Thank you." Josh's wife turned away, her face a mixture of sympathy and disdain. "Break up with me. You are making a scene." But Josh was beyond reason. With his voice rising, he grabbed her arm. "You can't walk away from me. I'm going to die without you." Mark watched the spectacle with joy. Even though he hadn't intended to, everything was working perfectly when the restaurant security guard showed up and started to pull Josh away. Mark stood up and said with false concern, "I'm really sorry. Josh has been struggling lately. Maybe we should call someone for him." But Josh's increasingly desperate cries drowned out Mark's comments. "Fairness is lacking. Why does he get to keep everything while I go bankrupt? Not fair." Mark glanced back at the table as Josh was finally escorted out of the restaurant. Instead of sympathy, the table was now full of looks of appreciation and respect also for Mark's handling of the situation. Mark allowed himself a slight but satisfied smile. Phase of his strategy was complete. Laura's reputation was completely damaged, and her support network was destroyed. Now it was time for Phase 2. He had no idea that Laura and Josh were preparing for a last desperate counterattack. Laura returned to the dimly lit motel room and her head was spinning. Just a few weeks ago, how had it come to this? She had a house, a family, a decent career. Now she was completely alone, jobless, and homeless. Her reverie was interrupted by a knock on the door. She opened it slowly to find Josh standing there looking as awful as she felt, unshaven with dark circles under his eyes. "We should talk," he said, pushing past her into the hallway. Laura tried to close the door. "Josh, what else is there to say? Everything we once owned is gone." Despair shone in Josh's eyes as he turned to her. "Not everything, not yet. We still have fighting spirit." Laura sighed. "Fight back against what the whole town despises us for. Mark has eaten everything. It ends here." "No," Josh insisted, touching her shoulders. "We can't let him be so successful. We should face him, show him what he has created." Laura shook off his hands and turned away. "And exactly how do you suggest we achieve this? No one else will listen to us." Josh's eyes darkened. "We don't need them to listen. We just need to scare Mark enough to back off, make him think we have something against him." Have Laura paused. She had nothing left to lose, and the idea of wiping that arrogance off Mark's face seduced her. "What were you thinking?" she asked. Finally Josh turned to her. A shadow of his former charm returned. "She showed up at his apartment without warning. You try to touch his feelings, remind him of your shared past. I will threaten legal action. Libel, slander, the works." Laura nodded gently. Even though it was all they had, it was hardly a strategy. "Okay," she replied, "let's do it." They arrived the next evening at Mark's new residence. It was larger than the one he had told Laura about, with a manicured lawn set back from the street. Laura's heart ached with grief and anger just looking at it. They arrived marching at the front door. Laura's heart pounded in her chest. Josh knocked. His face was determined, and the door opened to reveal Mark. As he looked at them, he seemed slightly surprised, as if they were unexpected but not unpleasant attendees of the dinner. He said, his voice casually, "Beautiful, as surprising as that is. Please come over." Mark added. Laura and Josh looked at each other, startled at Mark's composure. They always felt out of place, and dragged him into a large living room. "What can I do for you?" asked Mark. Sat down in an armchair and looked at her politely. Laura walked forward. Her practiced sentence was dead on her lips. What came out instead was emotional and honest. "Please, Mark, this is defrauding. We shared this for 15 years, so it means nothing to you." Mark's expression remained the same. "To me, it meant everything until you threw it away for him." Laura nodded at Josh, who Mark bristled. "Now listen." Josh started pumping his chest. "What they have done is defamation, slander, unlawful activity. For all they have, we could sue them for shock." Mark burst out laughing. Laura felt shivers run down her spine from that cool, humorless sound. "Please, I do." Mark walked over to Josh and repeated it, standing up. "With which lawyer? With what money?" "Do you know your lawyer is currently working with me? When I made him a bigger offer, he was really happy to hand over their case files." Josh's face turned white. "You can don't do that," he said in a whisper. Mark grinned predatorily. "I already have. None of them will work in this town. Like, I spoke to their old companies at the clinic before." In fact, he went onto his desk and pulled out a file they could be worrying about more pressing matters not too far from now. He handed Laura a paper. Her legs gave out as she read it, and she collapsed onto the couch. "Embezzlement," she gasped. "The evidence points to something else." Mark pushed her away. When a competent forensic accountant knows where to look, his findings are often remarkable. He turned to Josh, still holding a sheet. "For you too, Josh, is a foreclosure on your apartment. It turns out your wife signed her rights." Quite contentedly, Josh reached numbly for the paper. "I told her about the circumstances." His earlier arrogance lost all charm. Mark stood over him, his voice icy and final. "You are looking for a fresh life now. Laura noticed you have it too. Not the one you were hoping for." He opened the door and dismissed her unequivocally. "If you would be, I would start packing. Regarding these embezzlement charges, the authorities will be contacting you shortly." Laura and Josh staggered out of the house, and suddenly their circumstances sank in weight. They had come to scare Mark into taking a step back from their lives. Instead, they had found how completely he had ravaged them. Shock and hopelessness drove them to stand on the sidewalk and stare at each other. Long shadows of the sun fell across the manicured grass of Mark's new neighborhood. It seemed the ideal metaphor for the darkness that was closing in on them right now. "What is our action?" Laura murmured. Her voice faltered. Josh turned his head. His eyes seemed hollow. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm not sure what we could do." Laura felt finality wash over her as they turned away from Mark's house. The collapse of her marriage and her affair with Josh were not the only things that marked this. Laura couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of her nightmare. As the last glimmer of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, it marked the end of everything she had ever known or longed for. Laura looked at the subpoena she held in her hand, her eyes filled with blurry tears. Embezzlement charges, that was impossible. She had never stolen a dime in her life, but there it was in black and white, ordering her to appear in court. Through the filthy motel room Josh walked like a trapped animal, his face a mask of anger and grief. "This is garbage," he screamed, throwing a chair away. "We have not behaved ethically at all." Laura turned and stared at him, disgusted. How had she ever thought this man was beautiful? She now saw only a weak, pathetic shell of a human being who had helped destroy their families and lose their jobs. She muttered angrily, "Josh, we only have each other, but it's worthless. We ruined everything." Josh whirled around on her with glowing eyes. "You dare pin this on me? It was you. Your child got." Laura's voice grew to match his intensity. "If you had been more careful, if I had been more careful, it was you. The lie about your marriage. You turned my life upside down." They stared at each other with contempt. Once passion had brought them together, now it was turning into something ugly and dangerous. Laura felt like she was going to faint. How had things come to this? The days went by, and her circumstances got worse. Her workplace, where they had held their illegal meetings, the clinic, now turned against her former colleagues, spoke harshly of Laura and Josh, calling them manipulative crooks who had betrayed their position for personal gain. Laura watched in horror as her life spiraled out of control. She discovered her assets had been frozen. When she tried to hire a lawyer, she had nothing left to contribute, and no one would take her case without cash in front. Josh's fall was much faster and harder. The pressure and guilt of circumstance took its toll, and he started drinking. As soon as Laura was warm, she flinched from his touch, fearful of the anger she saw in him one night after a particularly wild fight that left her with a battered cheek. Laura woke up to find Josh was gone. His few belongings were, along with her meager remaining money, gone. He had left her just as she had left her family alone. Laura felt the weight of her loneliness pressing against her shaking fingers in the crumbling apartment. She longed for a lifeline and dialed her sister's number. "I knew I've messed up," she muttered as the phone rang, "but I need help. I know where else to go." On the other side of the phone, the silence was boundless. Her sister's voice was cool and far away. When she finally spoke, "Laura, you chose what you wanted. You have to live with it now. Don't call here again." The line went dead. Laura crouched on the floor, racked by sobs. She owned nothing now, her house, her job, her family. What an ugly affair that had fallen apart at the first sign of trouble. Laura sank deeper into hopelessness as the days melted away. She barely slept and barely ate. Her only hope keeping her going was that a small part of her former life could somehow be salvaged. Fate had other ideas, however. Early one morning, Laura awoke from a fitful sleep to a loud knock on the door. She opened it to find two stern-looking police officers standing in the corridor. Laura Buford, one of them, asked, if not exactly a question. Laura nodded, her heart pounding numbly in her chest. "You are under arrest for fraud and embezzlement. You are free to say nothing at all in court. Anything you say can and will be used against you." The officer's comments became a muffled roar. Laura felt cool metal clothing encircle her wrists. "Nothing like that happens here. It had to be a dream, like fantasy." Laura noticed something in her mailbox as they escorted her out of the apartment building, a letter, crisp and professional, that appeared with a sinking sense. It was from Mark's lawyer. She noticed. She begged the police to wait. "Please, can I just ask?" she begged. They ignored her, but forcibly directed her towards the waiting police car. Laura caught one last glimpse of the letter as she was placed in the back seat. She could see the words that destroyed what was left of her world had stayed even from afar. "Mark Bufford is now sole custody of Jacob." Laura felt the last strands of her former existence breaking as the car door closed. She drove away, leaving behind the wreckage of everything she had previously owned. Laura closed her eyes and turned to the darkness that had threatened to consume her for so long. Miles away in a neighborhood different from the run-down region Laura had been arrested for, Mark Bufford stood in the driveway of his new house. A small smile played at the edges of his mouth as he watched Jacob throw a basketball over a hoop that was above the garage. "Good shot, son," he yelled at another basket from Jacob. "Thank you, Daddy." Jacob turned and flashed a smile. "I appreciate you, Daddy. Hey, before dinner, do you want to play a quick game?" Mark nodded, then looked at his watch. "Yes, but why not first until 10 a.m.? Mark was amazed at how quickly Jacob had adjusted to their new existence. Immediately after Laura's betrayal, the boy's anger and pain had gradually given way to a calm resilience. Marcus thought he had helped bring about this change by teaching Jacob about the value of strength and independence against adversity. Later that evening, as they sat at the dinner table in their spacious new kitchen, Jacob looked up from his plate with a serious expression on his face. "At Papa," he began gently, "I wanted to thank you for everything. It helps keep Mom from splitting up our family." Even though Mark kept his face subtly neutral, he experienced an outburst of emotion. "Jake, you are not obligated to thank me. We are family. We stick together no matter what." Jacob nodded with a look of approval that made Mark's chest swell with pride. He thought he made it all worthwhile. The suffering, the betrayal, the brutal steps he had taken to ensure Laura and her boyfriend suffered for their actions. Everything had been for this moment. The bond he now had with his son Mark disappeared into his study as Jacob cleared the table. He filled himself a glass of scotch and curled up in the leather armchair behind his desk. The room stood as a testament to his success. Dark wood paneling, shelves with leather-bound books, framed certificates and awards on the walls, but Mark's eyes wandered to a small unopened package in the corner of the desk. While he drank, once so familiar, Laura's penmanship now seemed strange and threatening. His lawyer had forwarded a letter that morning. He understood what it contained without opening it, surely a desperate attempt to regain a tiny part of the life she had so carelessly thrown away. A request to see Jacob. Mark's hand hung over the envelope. For a moment a part of him long buried murmured that perhaps he had gone too far, that the retribution he had sought had deviated from justice to cruelty. Then he thought back to Jacob's face. The boy remembered the suffering in his son's eyes when he had found La with Josh. The betrayal had aged him far beyond his years, and Mark fixed himself once more with a firm swing. He picked up the letter and threw it in the trash next to his desk. Then he found a match, lit the paper, and watched Laura's words burn to ash. It was an appropriate metaphor, he thought, for the final erasure of their shared past. Mark turned back to his desk as the last flames disappeared. Work still needs to be done, a future needs to be created. He had protected his son and made sure Laura and Josh were never able to cause harm again. Now it was time to turn around and welcome the fresh life he had fought so bravely for. The sun was setting outside the study window, splashing vibrant oranges and purples across the sky. Mark allowed himself a small smile. Tomorrow would be another day, another step forward. Laura sat on the edge of a small austere cell in the county jail with her head in her hands, feeling the torment of the past and the promise of the future. Finally her reality was setting in, and she was numb with shock and hopelessness. She remembered the horrific day Jacob had caught her with Josh in the restaurant, although it was pointless to focus on what-ifs when she could go back for a moment and change her choices, and the path she had chosen had inevitably brought her to this cold, lonely place. Laura was tormented by memories of her former life. As evening fell and the prison fell silent, the sound of Jacob's laughter, the coziness of Mar hugging, the little joys of family dinners and leisurely Sundays. Everything is gone now, ruined by her own selfish needs. She thought of Josh and wondered where he was now. Had he been able to avoid the consequences of her affair, or was he also living with the terrible truth of her behavior? Laura discovered she rarely thought of direction. Her once consuming desire was burned away, leaving only ash and guilt. Laura knew this was her new life. As she lay on the awkward bed staring at the ceiling, her old life vanished as finally as if it had never existed. All that remained was a long road ahead, darkened, a road laid with the results of her decisions. Weeks turned into months, and Laura's case finally came to court. She sat in the courtroom, barely able to identify the hollow-eyed woman she saw on the shiny surface of the defense table. Although both realized it was futile, her court-appointed attorney went through the proceedings. Thanks to Mark's careful preparation, she was surrounded by overwhelming evidence against her. When the decision was made, guilty on all counts, Laura was empty. She had the knowing from the moment the shackles were wrapped around her wrists as the judge made her decision: 5 years in state prison. She caught sight of Mark sitting in the back of the courtroom. Her eyes closed for a split second, and Laura saw no triumph in his gaze, no satisfaction, just a cold, relentless will. The years behind bars faded into a haze. Laura went through the routines of everyday life: meals, homework, sporadic visits to the recreation yard, but she felt cut off from everything, like she was watching someone else's life unfold. She received no mail or visitors. Her family had washed their hands of her completely. She would find herself wondering about Jacob in the middle of the night, and wondering what kind of young man he would become, but those thoughts hurt too much to last long. As her release date approached, Laura experienced both excitement and fear. What kind of life would she live outside? She was empty-handed, her house, her job, her family all gone, with her beliefs weighing on her like a black cloud. She would start the day with less than nothing. Her release. Laura waited at the prison gates, a small bag with her few belongings in her hand. She took a deep breath and tried to conjure up a feeling, any feeling about her newfound independence. But there was an empty lesson where her heart used to be. Laura knew that her sentence was far from over when she got out on the street. The 5 years behind bars had only been the beginning. The true sentence would be the loss of everything and everyone she had ever loved. That would last a lifetime. Mark Buffort, a young man on the verge of adulthood, lounged idle in a comfortable chair and leafed through a college brochure on the porch of his house in a quiet, upscale neighborhood across the street. "Have they decided if we should apply?" Mark asked, taking a sip of iced tea. Jacob shrugged, a conscious look on his face. "I find myself drawn towards Stat. Their business program is supposed to be top-notch." Mark nodded benevolently. "That's it, and it's not far from where we live." "That's fantastic," Jacob replied. They sank into a comfortable silence and enjoyed the peace of that evening. A few minutes later Jacob spoke again, his voice uncertain. "Dad, do you ever think about Mom?" Mark kept a neutral expression, if a little sloppy occasionally. He admitted it. "It's hard not to, considering everything that has happened." Jacob nodded very gently. "She was named in the paper the other day. That's her out of prison now," said Mark, waiting for his son to continue. "Do you think?" Jacob paused, trying to find the right words. "We did the right thing, in her opinion." Cut her off completely. Mark was silent for a very long time and thought about his answer for a long time before he spoke. His voice was soft. "Your mother made choices, Jake. She was willing to throw our family aside for an affair with another man. Those choices were hers." He turned to stare at his son and felt the tension in the young man's eyes. "Although I know it hasn't been easy. Look at where we are right now. You're starting college to make a life for yourself. Surely we've come through stronger than others." Jacob nodded slowly. "Sure, I suppose we have." Mark reached forward and squeezed his son's shoulder. "The past is the past, Jake. We can't change it." As if on cue, the mail truck pulled up to their door. "All we can do is move forward and make the most of what we already have." Jacob stood up and stretched. "I'll find it," he replied, and ran to the mailbox. Mark watched him walk away, a small smile dancing at the corners of his mouth. They had weathered the storm. Together with Jacob, their relationship was stronger than ever. Whatever questions or regrets may remain, Mark knew he had done what was necessary to protect his son, to make sure Laura's betrayal didn't ruin their lives. Jacob returned, turning the stack of envelopes over and adding more collagenations with bills. He muttered, then stopped and pulled out a plain white envelope. "This is for you, Daddy," he said, noticing there was no return address. Mark grabbed the letter, and a feeling of unease sank into his stomach as he recognized the handwriting. Laura kept trying to fit back into her life, even after all this time. "What is it?" Jacob inquired. His speech radiated obvious curiosity. Mark was already stuck the unopened letter in his pocket. "Nothing particularly significant," he said firmly. "Just business, nothing to worry about." Mark's thoughts were already set. When they returned to the house, Jacob would burn the letter later that night. Just as he had destroyed all the others, Laura would stay in her past, where she belonged. The dawn, bright and clear, woke them. The next morning, Mark stood in the kitchen making himself a pot of coffee. Jacob came downstairs with a backpack over his shoulder. Mark asked on the way. He poured 2 glasses of coffee. Jacob nodded and reached for one of the cups. "Thank you kindly." "Absolutely," replied Mark. "I'm seeing several friends to prepare for the championships. I'll be back for dinner." Mark felt a brief flash of emotion as Jacob turned to leave. He cried out, and his son stopped at the door. "I just want you to know that I'm proud of the man you've grown into." Jacob smiled, appreciating the words. "Thank you, Dad. We deserve to be proud too for overcoming everything." Then he disappeared, and Mark watched as Jacob got into his car and drove away. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Mark moved to the window. Now there is nothing but ashes in the hearth regarding Laura and Josh and all the torment and betrayal of the past. He looked at the letter. Mark felt calm. However, as he drank his coffee and watched the neighborhood come alive around him, the rest was on his side. The storm had passed as exact planned, and executed. Retribution was total. He and Jacob had lived, served, and come back even stronger on the other side. Whatever the future may bring, whatever ghost of the past may arise, Mark understood that he and his son would go through it together. A hurricane they had survived, they could endure anything. Mark looked away from the window as the early sun rose higher in the sky. Work had to be done, a future had to be created, and he was ready for whatever lay ahead. Here ends our story. Feel free to leave your comments in the space provided. I appreciate your time. If you enjoyed this story, I suggest you check out more incredible audio stories by clicking on the video that will now appear on your screen.